опитування на екран. Питання. Який середній темп зростання економіки реального валового внутрішнього продукту очікується в наступні 5 років? З 2017 по 2021 роки. Ваша точка зору. В реальності, що буде відбуватися? Питання А. 0%. Питання Б. До 2% в середньому. Питання С. Від 2 до 5%. І питання Д. Більше 5%. Ще раз, який середній темп зростання економіки, реального внутрішнього валового продукту очікується, з вашої точки зору, в наступні 5 років в Україні? Будь ласка, відповідайте. 0% мало, 0,2 – 37%, 2,5 – 54%. Більшість вважає, що від 2 до 5%. І майже ніхто не вважає, що більше 5% в середньому. Добре, дякую. І в мене питання до Івана Міклоша. Mikloš, you've seen the distribution of the predictions of the economic growth by the audience. Majority believes that it will be between 2 and 5%, and almost no one believes it will be above 5%. What's your view on the prospects of the economic growth in Ukraine, and what does Ukraine need to actually attain them?
Yeah, I didn't vote, but if I was voting, my answer could be this majority answer, between 2 and 5, but it is necessary to say, of course, that it depends what will be done. If reforms will be deepened, then it is possibility at the end of this period, which means 2020, 2021, then it is possible to vote also for answer D, which means more than 5%. Now, what is the most important for the growth? And I will touch also previous discussion about monetary policy. Monetary policy is, of course, important, but not decisive. It is necessary to have independent central bank, sound banking sector. It is very good that Ukraine has floating, managed floating. But we can look at the countries, successful transition countries, which had floating system, and they achieved high economic growth. Not Baltic countries, because they didn't have floating, but there's Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, for instance, and Hungary. But Hungary is a different case, because they didn't achieve such high growth. And if you look at the role of monetary policy, you can see that it was not decisive. Decisive was fiscal consolidation and sound macro stabilization, which means part of this is also banking sector monetary policy, but fiscal stabilization, and then structural reforms. What happened, for instance, in Hungary? In Hungary, they didn't do necessary reforms. It was very expansive fiscal policy. It had to be neutralized by restrictive monetary policy, which means high interest rates, worse situation for enterprises and entrepreneurs, then even removing the demand on household loans to Swiss francs and euro, and then after devaluation, big problems and tensions because people were not able. In Russia happened the same. What happened in Slovakia, Poland, and also in Czech Republic? Thanks to responsible fiscal policy and structural reforms, during floating, it was stable inflation because it was inflation targeting, which is very important. But at the same time, it was appreciation of the currency, which means a revaluation, but appreciation is more precise. And this appreciation came by 2 channels. First one was nominal appreciation, because Slovak crown, for instance, strengthened because increase of competitiveness and because high economic growth. But it was also real appreciation through the higher inflation in comparison with inflation in dollars, in the US or in euro. And this, what happened in Ukraine during last year is real appreciation, because if inflation this year will be 12% and it will be stable nominal rate, then it will be real appreciation. Which means you can see, it is, in my opinion, currency rate of hryvnia will be good indicator which will show if government is doing reforms or not. Which is economic growth, and it is possible to achieve high economic growth even together with macro stabilization. which is kind of contradictory because macro stabilization means restrictive fiscal policy, which means giving less money to economy, which means reduce aggregate demand. But if reforms are deep enough and comprehensive enough, this stabilization can take very short time. And in Ukraine, the worst period is behind us. The most difficult stabilization measures were done. Now inflation is stabilized, currency rate is stabilized, which means now structural reforms can bring relatively quick results. And I think Ukraine, I don't know any other country which is such far below its potential. If country is below its potential, it means that correct policies, correct the reforms, will bring relatively quick economic results. And I don't see any reason why, if Ukraine will do these necessary changes and reforms, which we have mentioned, I have mentioned them in which area, which means to continue in macroeconomic stabilization, but also to speed up necessary structure and institutional changes, then Ukraine has potential to achieve more than 5%, but long and sustainable economic growth. I don't see any reason why not, because potential is huge. Especially potential is in very cheap and qualified labor force, which is in Ukraine. But Ukraine has to be open, has to attract investment, because Ukraine is not the smallest country, much bigger than Slovakia, but still, only possibility for achieve high economic growth is to open and to be competitive in mass industrial production. Like Slovakia. Slovakia didn't produce any personal cars 25 years ago. Now we are #1 in the world, and our growth is based on reforms and on export. And Ukraine has this potential, which means to tell now what will be correct answer is very difficult, because it will depend on reforms. And reforms will depend also on political will, political leadership.
Ownership and communication.
And ownership and communication,
As you always suggest rightly.
Yeah.
So I would like to finish up with asking you another question.
Yeah.
What do you think is the optimal rate of the budget deficit for Ukraine? You advocate discipline, you advocate structural reforms, you advocate tight policy, suggesting that combined with structural reforms, they will actually bring economic growth despite the tightness. And so the question is, assuming structural reforms are going to go ahead, what's the optimal percentage of the budget deficit for Ukraine?
I mean, for this year and next year, as it is in the program with the IMF, I think it is correct. Then, of course, it will depend on further development, because the general rule is clear. If there is growth, if there is boom, then it is necessary to have more restrictive policy to create space for more expansive policy in time of bust. Which means in this regard now, this deficit around 2–3% are okay. I don't see problem on this. But very important is also if it is sustainable and how this fiscal consolidation is done. Because you can do fiscal consolidation, you can reduce deficit by increasing taxes, for instance. Yeah, you can achieve relatively good results in budget, but you are undermining economic growth. Which means much better, especially in economy like Ukraine, is to do fiscal consolidation by reduction of the expenditures. And this is what happened, because Ukraine, before Maidan, had public expenditures to GDP more than 50%. Now it was reduced on level about 44%. But still it is too much. Countries like Baltic countries or Slovakia, when we did our reforms, after we did our reforms, our public expenditures as shared to GDP were about 37%. Of course, then it is much bigger space for business, with much lower tax burden. Which means not only figure is important, very important is structure of this consolidation, on which side you are doing this. But to do this correct reduction and sustainable reduction of public expenditures has to be connected with structural reforms. Because if you will not reform your social system, your healthcare, your education, your public administration, if you will not reduce overemployment, wasting money, corruption, in public sector, then of course it is very difficult to reduce public expenditures on sustainable base.